she said, I work at the zoo, and I'm going to talk to you shortly today about the work we do at the zoo with California Least Tern research recovery. So to start off, I'll start off just by explaining some California Least Tern natural history, so just that everybody's on the same page on for what the least terns, how they make a living. So they're small seabirds. They're about 40 grams, 42 grams, on a full stomach, pretty small. They're long-lived seabirds. They live up to 15 to 25 years on average. On average, and then they migrate every spring to California to nest. They nest on open beaches from Monterey to Baja California, and they use simple sand scrapes as nests. They lay 1 or 2 eggs, sometimes 3, and then they incubate these nests for 21 days after the last egg is laid. And then they feed on small fatty fishes, such as anchovies and sardines, and also silver sides to make a living. So here's an example of a 2-egg clutch with one chick hatched. Chicks are semi-precocial, and what that means is that they can move around out and about pretty quickly after they hatch. When they hatch, they're pretty wet, and once they're fluffy, they can walk around within a day. And they need to do so to hide from predators. You can see the picture on your left, how that bird is already fluffy. And there's the one bird that is hiding from predators. They also use their their coloring to camouflage in the nest, in the sand. I don't know, do you guys see a tern there? But now you can see it really well. So they take advantage of that coloration to blend really well into the sand. And this is one of the things that we do when we go out monitoring. That's our main focus is, we have to count every nest and every eggs, but we can't step on any little birds. So for 21 days after they hatch, the chicks are completely dependent on their parents for food and partly dependent on for protection and warmth. So the right-hand picture shows you a parent feeding a chick while it's the other parent keeps it warm. So there's high parental investment in raising chicks. And then both parents take turns in bringing back food for the fish, and then chick eventually teaching the chick to fly. And to fish on its own once the chick is fledged and flying. Here on the right, you can see, on the left, you can see, a parent bringing some fish to his chicks. And on the right, you can see a fledgling that is pretty much ready to fly and will start learning how to fish on its own. So I think right now, I hope I convinced you that one of the most important aspects that least terns need to thrive in Southern California is habitat, pristine, undeveloped, isolated beaches. Something that heavily changed in California after World War II, when there was a huge increase in coastal development. So this caused the nesting populations to decrease of least terns in California, and the species decreased was listed as endangered in 1970. So this shows here what the nicely recovery after it was listed. The recovery was really nice for the terns after it was fairly protected, especially here in Southern California with the help of the Marines and the Navy. The recovery was really nice from the 1970s all the way to 2009. And then something happened after 2009 when we've seen this pretty bad decrease. And that's what the main focus of my lab currently has been, is figuring out why are terns declining after 2009. And one idea that we have is that ocean warming could be the culprit. And we say this because ocean warming can cause the spring bloom to come later in California, causing a mismatch of peak fish abundance with peak least tern nesting, when all those chicks not just need the amount of food, but also the timing, when to have that food available, when to their parents. So to help explain this, there's a figure on the right. It shows a typical depth profile of the 2 most important factors of ocean productivity: light, sunlight, and nutrients. And you can see that light and nutrients are maximum at opposite extremes. So you have tons of light in the surface, and as you go deep, the light disappears, and you have tons of nutrients at depth, because that's where all the organic matter settles and decomposes. So during winter, you have lots of nutrients at the surface because you have a lot of mixing from winter storms, but because of the short days, you have not that much productivity. And Conversely, in the summer, you have a lot of light with longer days, but you have very little mixing, so not much productivity. So that's why in spring, you have the perfect storm for lots of productivity, and you have the spring bloom. And this is what could be happening later or after because of ocean warming. And this is the main reason why terns, it's not random why terns come to California in the spring. It's because they want to time their arrival with the spring bloom. So a warmer and more stratified ocean is much harder to mix. This is because the density gradients in the layering of the ocean get stronger and you need much more energy to mix when the water column is warmer. So you can think of it you have two glasses of water, and both of them have oil on the top, but one of them has much more oil. So if you leave those out and about, the one with much more, that higher oil layer is going to take more energy to mix than the one with a thin oil. So that's what's happening in the ocean when it's getting much warmer. The energy that it takes to mix those density gradients increases, and then there's less nutrients coming to the surface. And so what can happen is it could cause localized spring blooms to occur later, or they just don't happen at all. And then there's a changing in the time when the fish are most abundant in Southern California. So this is the most important thing for the terns. If you arrive at a certain time and there's not enough food for you to feed your chicks, they could have a really bad year. So I hope, nesting least terns need plenty of fish to feed themselves and the chicks. And we think the reason for that decline that I showed you earlier is the frequent mismatches of the spring bloom is what's causing the recent population to decline. And we have a little bit of evidence for this. This is what I'm showing you here is the peak nesting of least terns in Coronado. So on the vertical axis is the number of nests. On the horizontal axis is the day of the year. And then all those different color lines are different years. So I just want you guys to appreciate the variability in the timing of the nests, but just how, for example, the black line, those terns were hoping for, good fish abundance around May 15th. And they probably got it because they had a good year. But for example, the gray line, that didn't happen on May 15th. It happened on June 15th. So that's why it's really important to match their arrival really well with the spring bloom. So we do a bunch of research to get support for this hypothesis. And one thing that we do is we put out time-lapse cameras, just like the guys do here at the zoo at the NAT. So we put a bunch of time-lapse cameras on the colonies at both bases, and these cameras they're shown on the bottom left. It's just almost like a blind. We program them to take a picture every minute for every day for the 21 incubation period. And we've been doing this for 5 years, including this year, and the 2 sites. And so we have about almost 2.5 million pictures that we get. And so we classify the pictures by hand it goes pretty quick, but we learn a lot from the pictures, but we classify them as having an adult or not. And we get this really informative binomial database, time series, of how long of absences. But terns are always going to leave their nest, but there's absences that are just too long, and so we want to know what is driving those long absences, because it's probably going to be because they're looking for food. So we found one very obvious result from this and one not very obvious. The one that's very obvious is that terns are more absent during the daytime, which is pretty obvious, and that's because terns are visual predators. They need sunlight to fish, and so they're more absent fishing at daytime. But the one that is not obvious at all, was a huge surprise, is that we also found that terns were much more absent, but a lot more absent during high tides. And what we think is driving this, so this is just a probability curve of all those, like a regression, a logistic regression of that data set. But what we think is going on here is that because terns are plunge divers, they can only plunge about 10 centimeters into the water. So we think that they're off their nest in looking for food in areas that get flooded during high tide. And that's why the high tide is they're off during they're just fishing at high tide because there's just more fish available in these areas that are now deep that were not deep. Another thing we're doing to corroborate this is to use VHF telemetry to learn how far and where the terns are looking for food. So just recently, well, not that recent, but within the last 10 years, the VHF telemetry devices that are available are much, much, much smaller. I mean, you can even call them they're miniaturized. And because terns are so small, we found a way to put these safely, to put these gizmos on the tern's back. We use just super glue, which is very uninvasive, and it also ensures us that the transmitter is going to fall off once the glue degrades. But we know that they can stay up to 28 days, which is plenty of time for us to find out what they're doing. And then we use automated multi-directional VHF receiving arrays to try to get the direction and distance where the terns are feeding by triangulation. And this is so our hope is we've only started this year, and our hope is to do this continuously for the next 4 or 5 years, and then see differences between feeding behavior when they matched the spring bloom versus when they didn't. So I want to relate this research a little bit to worldwide conservation of birds in general. So California Least Terns mirror seabird conservation issues worldwide. So because they have to maneuver through the same forage fish shortages that several other endangered birds do. For example, African penguins in South Africa. If you list out why South African penguins are endangered, it's basically the same reasons why least terns are endangered. So one of our big goals is to use local species to highlight and advance worldwide conservations worldwide. And I have a little bit of time left. I'm going to go over my acknowledgments. And I just want to end up on a good note about, even though the terns are not doing so well, seabirds in general are made for the long haul. If you give them a chance, they will rebound. And the reason I say this is there's, I think overall, Phil Union will tell me, there's about 10,000 species or so of birds worldwide, and only 300 are actual seabirds. So it's, with the amount of land, ocean available in the world, it doesn't really make sense that only 300 out of 10,000 birds are seabirds. And that's because life in the ocean is tough. I mean, it's super, super tough. There's no food is scarce. It's patchy. There's no fresh water. It's a tough life. And that's why seabirds in general live such long lives. Albatrosses can live up to 70 years. I mean, terns are such a small bird. They live 25 years. So they're made to go through these really bad patches and come back. I mean, I have a list here. Just you can see the list. But one really cluing thing here is just the amount of eggs, the clutch sizes that seabirds lay. The typical seabird lays 1 or 2 eggs, and the typical sparrow lays 4 or 8 eggs. And then so it's so seabirds are made for the long haul, and if we do our job right, I think they'll be able to come back. So before ending, I want to acknowledge the huge support that we get from the Navy, the Marines, NOAA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, California Fish and Wildlife, and also the San Diego Zoo. We could never do this work without their support. And then I'm going to end with a big thank you with a nosy tern.